Hello, welcome back. This is American Republic. In case you forgot what class you were in, this is chapter 21, the 1920s, a decade of change. Just a heads up for you guys, this is the first video for the next week. So if you are working ahead, getting things done, recognize that this is for next week, Monday. By that point, you should have finished all of the work from your first week's packet. You should have picked up your second packet by this point and taken the Chapter 20 test. If you haven't done any of that stuff, I recommend holding off on that. After all, you don't have the handout for these notes yet. So wait until you get the notes, wait until you take the Chapter 20 test, and then be ready to go. If you have all that material, congratulations, welcome to the next week. Let's get started. The thing to consider is the 1920s were a period of accelerated change, including changes in how Americans viewed their core values. For example, freedom has always been an American core value, but it can be understood in different ways. The Puritans looked for the freedom to do right. Unfortunately, in the 1920s, some Americans sought the freedom to do what pleased them, regardless of whether it was right or wrong. In this decade, many Americans were more open in their sins. Another thought for us to consider is, this was a huge change. In this section that we're going to talk about today, there's going to be a lot of to them, scary things going on in their lives. Not too different from what we are facing right now. We're dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. If you sit and watch the news for any length of time, it can get scary. I understand that. I try to avoid the news as much as I can, but sometimes you just got to hear it, got to see what's going on. We are dealing with a really scary time as well. We're not sure exactly what's going on, what's going to happen next. I've got a wedding in 2 months that I'm in, so obviously I want to make sure that, I can do this and that we get everything taken care of. But the fact of the matter is, we can still trust and depend upon God. He will take care of us. He saw this coming. He knew that it was coming. We can depend upon Him. He's got our best interest in mind. Let's use this opportunity as a chance to better glorify Him. In the 1920s, they were also dealing with change. Roman numeral 1, a post-war environment. After World War I, America emerged with some attitudes and problems in the upcoming decade. There was a desire to avoid getting involved in any more foreign conflicts and a growing fear of communism. We'll talk about that. Letter A, isolationism and peace. We know how isolationism works for us, quarantine. Well, they're talking about isolationism as a nation. After World War I ended, Wilson tried and failed to get the Treaty of Versailles approved by the Senate. And in 1920, desiring a return to normalcy, Republicans were voted into office in favor of isolation. Warren G. Harding won the presidency handily against the Democratic contender James Cox. Ideas for signing the treaty and joining the League of Nations were soon forgotten. The Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes was responsible for promoting peace around the U.S. In 1922, in order to cut expenses, the U.S. participated in the Washington Naval Conference, which limited the number of ships among leading nations. For every 5 British or American ships, Japan was allowed 3, and France and Italy were allowed 1 3/4. It was intended to cut expenses and to prevent military buildups, which could lead to war. Japan especially disliked the conference, believing it should have been given equal ranking with the U.S. and Britain. So already, an attempt at peace probably leads to more bitterness than anything else. End result, the treaty had little impact because there was no enforcement of the law, and nations built smaller ships that were not limited. By the end of the 1920s, the U.S. desired to take things a step further. In 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact optimistically outlawed war as a means of settling international disputes. Although signed with 62 other nations, the treaty was practically worthless. After all, it had no means of enforcement. What do you do when another country declares war on you? Oh, you can't do that. We'll go to war with you. Yeah, exactly. So, on the same day, for example, that the U.S. passed the treaty, it also passed another bill to spend $274 million to build warships. Again, a nice, optimistic law, but it's not going to work. Letter B. The Red Scare. Americans began to fear that communism would spread to the U.S. Russia had fallen to communism during World War I. The new Soviet Union organized the Third International, an agency that sought to create a world revolution by exporting communism everywhere. It had already begun in Europe, and by 1919, the communists had two political parties working in the U.S. The communists sought to create a struggle between common workers and the property-owning capitalists. Americans began to think that any sign of worker discontent, especially going on strike, was a part of a communist plot. This political cartoon, you can't read the bottom part. It says, "But come unto me, ye oppressed." Of course, that's the Statue of Liberty speaking, but then it shows a twist to it. The European anarchist holding a bomb ready to come and cause trouble. In 1919, speaking of bombs, a wave of anarchist letter bombs created more fear. The post office intercepted letter bombs addressed to 38 prominent Americans, including John D. Rockefeller, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Postmaster General, and the Attorney General. The U.S. government responded by arresting or deporting hundreds of possible communist immigrants. Deporting has to do with sending people back to the countries from which they came. The fear of communism increased Americans' resentment of immigrants, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Another situation, 1921, two Italian anarchists in America, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were arrested and disputably convicted of robbery and murder with little evidence. They were both executed for this crime. To this day, the evidence is still uncertain whether or not they were guilty. One theory suggests that both were innocent. Another theory claims that Sacco was guilty, but not Vanzetti. The court case divided Americans. We can think of times in our history in which a court case divides Americans. Well, this one divided Americans. Some people thought they're guilty. Others thought, no, they're innocent. They're just being tried because they are immigrants, anarchists. Letter C. After the war, the U.S. experienced a short depression. Please do not confuse this with the Great Depression. That'll take place at the end of this chapter. But at the beginning of this decade, there was a short depression as the nation transitioned from a wartime economy to a peacetime one. Factories that had built war material had to change their products. That took time and money. Farmers who had shipped excess food to Europe no longer did. Europe was able to feed itself again. Unemployment rose as soldiers returned from Europe to find work. Many Americans believed that blacks and immigrants had taken jobs that had been available. Again, we see an example. People who are different from us, the natural tendency is to feel threatened by them, feel like we need to do something to prevent this. Well, it's not a biblical response. It's not even a good response, but that's how naturally people tend to act. In the 1920s, it was immigrants, it was African Americans, it was anyone who was not the majority. They were considered a threat. New laws were created that set quotas to limit the number of immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, that could come to the U.S. These quotas set fixed numbers as to how many immigrants could arrive from a country each year. While Northern and Western European countries, the more traditional American immigrant countries, were given more freedom, Southern and Eastern European countries were limited substantially. Farmers continued to struggle during the 1920s as the U.S. government refused to get involved in economics. That's all we're going to cover for today. Reminder, if you haven't taken the Chapter 20 test, you need to have done so by now. Also, don't forget that the bonus assignment was due on test day. Well, lucky for you guys, you don't turn in the test to the end of the week, so you've got all of this week to remind yourselves to do that bonus assignment. If you have any questions, please Skype me or email me. Let me know as soon as you can. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.